and welcome viewers. I am Pia and you're watching the China Report on NewsX World, and here are the top headlines. Starting today, China has suspended its 24% additional tariffs on US goods for 1 year and has eased duties on select farm imports including soybeans. This follows last week's high-level talks to ease trade tensions. China grants export control exemptions on Xperia semiconductors for civilian use, easing chip shortages for global car makers. The move now follows recent US-China talks allowing short-term exports. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has announced plans to direct her cabinet in January 2026 to formulate a new multi-year fiscal target, which is a move aiming to replace Japan's annual budget goals. South Korea's special prosecutor indicts former President Yoon Suk-yeol for abuse of power and aiding North Korea, accusing him and his co-defendants of plotting military conflict with the neighbor. Typhoon Fungwong lashes in northern Philippines, killing at least 2 and cutting off towns as well. Over 1 million residents have been evacuated before the typhoon made its landfall in the Aurora province. 11 Rohingya have lost their lives after a boat has sunk near the Thailand-Malaysia border with about 70 on board. Another vessel carrying 230 remains missing, from which 13 survivors have now been rescued by authorities. South Korea's Coast Guard has launched a search after a Chinese fishing vessel has capsized off its west coast. 9 crew members are still missing, while 11 were believed to be on board. US senators have reached a bipartisan deal to resume federal funding, ending a record 40-day government shutdown. The stopgap agreement funds operations through January, resolving disputes over healthcare subsidies, food benefits, and federal employee firings. Well, viewers, those are the headlines and our top focus. China is now officially suspending the 24% additional tariffs it has imposed on US goods earlier this year. The suspension will now remain in effect for 1 year, offering a temporary relief to American exporters. However, a 10% base tariff on US goods will remain in place. Additionally, China will also lift tariffs of up to 15% on certain US agricultural products, including key exports like soybeans. While this marks a step towards easing trade tensions, the tariff on US soybeans will remain at 13%, making US shipments less competitive compared to cheaper Brazilian alternatives. Now, both moves come after last week's high-level meeting between US and Chinese leaders and also mark a further attempt to ease the ongoing trade dispute between the two countries. With us on the broadcast is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung. He's a strategist focusing on the Chinese economy and policy. Thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us on NewsX World. It's been quite the move from China. Of course, the world's eyes have been trained on this dispute that has been simmering between Washington and Beijing for quite a while. This is also being touted as a relief for the Americans in particular. Could this then offer some sort of respite to US soybean farmers? Because the tariffs on soybeans are still at 13%. As I mentioned earlier, it still makes them less competitive from cheaper alternatives such as Brazil or even Argentina for that matter.
Well, I think that the China wants to strike a deal with the Trump administration, just to have a pause in this mutually destructive tariff war. And China, of course, has found a very effective stranglehold on the United States' Achilles heel. First of all, the soybeans, because the soybeans, China has long been the biggest customer of American soybeans, and the soybeans are produced in the Midwest, in America's Midwest, which are the Republican Party's main supporter. And then with the midterm elections coming up, that sends shivers down the spine of the a lot of Republican policymakers and politicians. And so the soybeans is, of course, is the immediate concern of the Trump administration. And China's Beijing has found another very powerful stranglehold, which is, of course, is the rare earths. And it's doubling down on the a global control scheme, not to target the rest of the world, but to prevent this some of the key rare earth elements from being re-exported back to the United States. So I think that these two strangleholds gives China the confidence to confront Trump administration's coercion, which has set China apart from many other countries, and many other countries simply, have to give in a lot more in order to escape some of the extreme pressures of President Trump's tariff sledgehammer. Now, but China wants to pause because the China economy, of course, is weakening. And of course, there are lots of internal problems. But nevertheless, China is not giving up everything. It's just a pause. And of course, President Trump also wants a pause in order to, build up the United States rare earth capabilities, which of course cannot be done in a year or two, and could probably take even 5 or even a decade or more, because these is not just the supply, even though President Trump has struck rare earth deals with a large number of countries, but it's not the supply, it's the processing, and China controls as much as over 90% of some of the more essential rare earth elements, which find their use into all sorts of products, including F-35 fighter jets.
Yes.
So I think that this is now represents a pause phase for both Beijing and Washington.
Absolutely. So requesting you to stay on with us. Of course, you've spoken about the rare earths. It's of course also linked not just to manufacturing of defense equipment, but also semiconductor chips. Viewers, we're now learning that China has granted export control exemptions on semiconductors made by Chinese-owned Dutch-headquartered manufacturer Nexperia for civilian applications. Now, this move is aimed at easing supply shortages faced by global car makers. The Chinese Commerce Ministry's decision has marked Beijing's strongest signal yet that it intends to reduce pressure on the automotive industry, especially after curbs were imposed when the Dutch government had seized control of Nexperia on the 30th of September, citing national security concerns. Now, the seizure itself had disrupted supplies of basic automotive chips and had prompted China to block exports of finished Nexperia products that were being manufactured within China itself. Now, following a recent meeting between US President Donald Trump and China's leader Xi Jinping, China began accepting exemption applications. Volkswagen's China chief Ralph Brandstedt has now confirmed that the initial chip shipments have resumed, stating that Germany's Handelsblatt that Beijing had issued a short-term special permits following the US-China understanding that exempts Nexperia from US export restrictions for 1 year. While the resumption offers relief to automakers, reports have stated that tensions between China and the Netherlands, and by extension the European Union, still remain high, with Beijing now urging the EU to press The Hague to reverse its seizure of Nexperia. Stay with us on the broadcast is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung. Now, we've seen this play out for a couple of years. The Netherlands, due to pressure from the United States of America, had imposed some restrictions on China earlier itself, sometime around 2021. China, of course, responded by putting some restrictions on gallium and germanium. And then the Netherlands had doubled down. We've also recently seen attempts by some Dutch representatives heading to Beijing for talks on Nexperia itself. I wanted to understand from you, could this move then lead to supply chain stability, as we've been discussing?, you, know, these chips are important for manufacturing electric vehicles, of which China is in fact the largest producer in the world. How could this then sort of boost not just European car making supplies but also Chinese supplies?
Well, I mean, you have covered many different strands in this very complex semiconductor supply chain. First of all, at the top, the most advanced level in terms of the minuteness of the semiconductors, at a 3 nanometer. You know, a nanometer is almost a 1 millionth the width of a human hair. So these are very delicate, very precise kind of chips. China is not able to produce anything approaching 3 nanometers yet, but it's getting there. And of course, restrictions on some of the most advanced high-end chips still remain in place. And then these high-end chips are produced by extreme ultraviolet machines controlled in the world by one Dutch company called ASML. But of course, most of the supply goes to China. So that's one strand of this complex issue. Now, the other strand, in excess of 3 nanometers, there was also a range of semiconductors which find their use in all sorts of products like mobile phones and electric appliances and electric vehicles. Again, China is now increasingly able to produce these chips themselves. Now, even at the high end, China is achieving some sort of breakthrough in terms of AI chips, which does not rely on the extreme ultraviolet machines. But that is getting there. It's not entirely breakthrough, but it's a lot of progress already. So that's one end of the scale. Now, coming back to an Xperia, there's another different story, because an Xperia is controlled by the Xperia, by the way, is headquarters in the Netherlands.
Yes.
And it supplies chips, some of the lower end chips to all sorts of products for manufacturers in the European Union, including EV cars and so on. These are by no means the high-end chips, but they are the legacy chips. But they produce large quantities, and the headquarters of the company in Xperia is in the Netherlands. But Netherlands has recently found a kind of breakthrough, perhaps under some pressure from the United States, to seize control of this Xperia company. And of course, there's anger Beijing no end, because obviously, apart from the legality of this, Beijing sees this as trampling on China's sovereignty. But then, of course, the control of Xperia doesn't mean just the company, because Xperia in Netherlands depends on the supply of this legacy chips from the parent company in China. So which is called Wingtech.
Yes.
And then China retaliated by stopping all these supply of the chips to the Netherlands, and that forced the Netherlands government to come to an accommodation. So this is an entirely different story, an entirely different plane, entirely different level of chips, supplying different level of customers, mainly some of the manufacturers all over Europe. So in order to understand this complex issue, sometimes one can get lost in this technical maze, mixing the top high-end chips, especially those involving the Dutch company producing this extreme ultraviolet machines, very expensive, and that's the only company in the world, with the breakthrough in China, particularly with AI chips, and then with this legacy chips, which is an entirely different story.
Indeed, sir, requesting you to stay on with us. We're tracking some breaking updates coming in. We're now learning that the Chinese Transport Ministry has announced that it will suspend port fees on US-linked vessels for 1 year. The suspension now takes effect today at 1 p.m. local time. It is set to provide temporary relief to American shipping companies amid ongoing trade negotiations between the US and China. Still with us on the broadcast is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung, Of course, there were a lot of concerns earlier when China had, in fact, slapped these port fees. US also had done so earlier in the year. This is, of course, going to reduce the operating costs now. And in your assessment, how could this then further help strengthen the supply chains?
Well, shipping is entirely different story. What happens in the beginning was that the Trump administration has found a huge vulnerability in the shipping sector, in the sense that, first of all, shipbuilding has entirely been outsourced to other countries, especially China.
Yes.
Over the years, out of a total number of ships worldwide built by China, 1,000, American is building only 4.
Yes.
Or less. And then that, of course, affects not only the shipping industry itself, but also Americans' naval strength, because the shipbuilding industry can also supply military vessels. And hence, Trump is doubling down on trying to fracture China's shipping industry by imposing very hefty shipping fees, shipping charges on any ship built by China, regardless of the flag it carries. Provided the ship is built in China, it doesn't matter it carries a Panamanian flag, it carries a Dutch flag or German flag, it will all be subject to American charges. And the idea is that this way could cripple China's shipping industry and bring back the shipping industry to the United States. But this is, of course, is a pipe dream, because a shipping industry doesn't happen by waving a magic wand or by waving a tariff wand. You're talking about the infrastructure, the building infrastructure. You're talking about the shipping technicians, the technologies, the skill, and the whole manufacturing ecology that simply does not exist in the United States. So I think that, and then of course China's the ships, they do not only call on American ports, they call on Chinese ports all over the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe. So China's, the supply chain, when it is fractured, is hurting the entire world. And China, of course, has got more resilience in face of these shipping charges. So the United States is now recalibrating, is now scaling down this shipping charges as part of the trade deal with Beijing.
All right, so with that, I would like to thank you for taking out time and, of course, walking our viewers through these crucial developments and what their implications are. We are shifting focus to what's taking place in Japan. We're now learning that Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has stated that she will direct her cabinet in January 2026 to begin formulating a new multi-year fiscal target, marking a significant policy shift in Japan's approach to fiscal management. Now, Takaichi has clarified that her government will not immediately scrap the current annual primary budget target, but will instead move towards a framework that evaluates fiscal health over several years rather than on a year-to-year basis. The announcement was followed by remarks last week in which Takaichi, who is known for her pro-spending stance, suggested replacing Japan's long-standing annual fiscal goal with a more flexible multi-year measure. Now, under Japan's current blueprint, the government aims to achieve a primary budget surplus between the fiscal year 2025 and 2026. However, Takaichi has criticized this target as outdated and restrictive, arguing that it limits Japan's ability to deploy fiscal tools to support growth and shield households, especially from rising costs. Japan's public debt, viewers, stands at twice the size of its GDP, which is the highest among major economies. And of course, it highlights the challenge that Takaichi's government now faces as it seeks to balance fiscal stimulus with long-term sustainability as well. With us on the broadcast is Dr. Asta Chadda, who is an Associate Professor of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University, joining us from Kyoto. Thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us on NewsX World. Interestingly, what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, Takaichi is a proponent of aggressive government spending. The primary budget balance excludes new bond sales and debt servicing costs, and it will no longer serve as Japan's key fiscal indicator. And with her plan, it seems that Japan is shifting to a process that evaluates its economy's health over several years. How do you think this will impact the larger goal of ensuring that public debt does not continue to pile up, and at some point in time surplus is in fact seen helping the people on the ground?
Thank you, Pia, for having me to discuss this topic. I mean, see, in Japan, as you were correctly mentioning, for a large number of years, the focus had been on achieving a year-on-year primary budget surplus. And what that essentially meant was that the government was trying to commit every single year that they would water down they would actually try to achieve a surplus, which means they would try to achieve a quick fiscal cleanup. And the new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, when she says she wants to move from a year-on-year basis to, stretching it to several years, her approach, at least in Japan, is being seen as more of a responsible expansionary fiscal policy, because she is looking at the current economic woes in Japan. She's looking at the need to prioritize economic growth. Japan has, in some ways, stagnated. But unlike under Prime Minister Abe, the current issue with Japan is no longer that of deflation. It's related to cost push inflation. And so she needs to ensure that there is more economic growth, there's more investment into sectors that are going to grow over a number of years, rather than achieving some immediate strict fiscal consolidation, which would be very difficult to achieve anyway, given the current economic scenario. So what they're looking at is they're trying to boost growth through, make sure there are higher incomes, stronger consumption patterns, increasing tax revenues, but without raising any tax rates, for instance. Plus, Japanese government is going to try and invest in the key sectors which are more upcoming, AI, semiconductors, mainly tech-related, defense, energy. And this is to, again, point to Sanae Takaichi's policy of increasing the Japanese defense spending to 2% of the GDP, which she had already earlier announced. So put all in all together, she's trying to achieve a way more sustainable growth in a way that it also does not hurt the consumer on the ground.
Also, I wanted to understand from you, what are the potential risks of loosening fiscal constraints? Of course, Sanae Takaichi is looking at long-term sustainability of the Japanese economy, especially through supporting, as you mentioned, these strategic industries like semiconductor as well. But on the flip side, there are analysts pointing out of risks of not really monitoring the health of the economy on the short term and looking at a longer, larger, more protracted, through a more protracted lens.
Yeah, I mean, see, again, any such change which her cabinet is proposing at this point is going to be at a risk of not achieving what they want to achieve. But at the same time, one needs to know that the erstwhile policy of Japan in terms of year-on-year fiscal surplus policy, that was anyway very much out of sync with global standards and with the policy that other countries have, right? And in some ways, it did constrain Japan's ability to use specific fiscal tools required to propel their growth within the economy. So the core belief now is that the economy needs to grow first and the physical health needs to be dealt with later, rather than the other way around, which was Japan's primary objective. And that is a reality that has dawned on Japan, given that specifically since COVID, they are experiencing, with regards to the geopolitical events around the globe, they are experiencing a cost push inflation. So no longer can the previous policies, which we term as the three-pointed arrow policies under Prime Minister Abe, those are not going to be effective anymore because the economic reality in Japan has changed.
Indeed. Ma'am, requesting you to stay on with us as we're tracking further updates, this time from South Korea. We're learning that South Korea's special prosecutor has indicted former President Yoon Suk-yeol on additional charges including abuse of power and aiding another country. The charges stemmed from Yoon's alleged role in a failed attempt to impose martial law late last year. According to prosecutors, Yoon, along with former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun and former military intelligence chief Yo In-hyung, conspired to provoke a military conflict with North Korea. The trio is accused of creating a covert drone operation aimed at igniting tensions in order to justify declaring martial law. Evidence gathered from a military official's phone reportedly includes references to provocative actions such as drones and surgical strikes. North Korea claimed that the South sent drones to scatter anti-North leaflets last year. While South Korea at that time had declined to comment on the accusations, Yoon and his co-defendants are now denying the charges, with Yo expressing regret for not challenging Yoon's orders. With us on the broadcast is Dr. Asta Chadha. Of course, South Korea has a rather tumultuous history as far as martial law is concerned. How it was imposed all the way back in the 80s and the crackdowns that used to take place over there at that time is still very well ingrained in the minds of the people, of the South Koreans. But this fresh information, these fresh charges that have now come to light, and now that Yoon Suk-yeol has been indicted on as well, considering the current administration's attempts to offer an olive branch to North Korea, how could this incident and what's come to light then influence the narrative and influence the efforts that are being made by the current administration as well?
Yeah, thank you, Pia. I mean, you correctly pointed out this incident brings to light the fact that, that is the accusation against the ex-president Yoon, that he was attempting in some way to stoke a military conflict with North Korea or incite some kind of an attack or some kind of an adverse action from the North Korean side, with which he would, or based on which he would then be able to justify the martial law, or be able to, stir some sort of a domestic crisis, which could be beneficial to him politically. But, there are obviously very dire implications of that, that given the current administration is trying to, in some way, extinguish that sort of a rage that has always remained, at the North Korea, South Korea borders. This risks distrust between the two countries. I mean, the very revelation that this time an attempt to stoke that conflict came from the South Korean side, this very idea of a provocation from the South could pretty much derail any such possibility of building trust between the two countries. That's one, but that's not all. I mean, this could be a huge setback for any future diplomacy, because remember, the whole idea of future inter-Korean dialogue or some sort of a reconciliation effort is being planned on the foundation that they are going to be able to build trust and move beyond this hostile intent sort of a political narrative that flows on both North and South Korean sides. So any such revelations that this was in some way being promoted or provoked from the highest echelons of the South Korean political elites, this could be very, very detrimental to North Korea, South Korea diplomacy and peace building or any such dialogue in the future. And then lastly, I do feel that this could be used by in some way by North Korea when they try to conduct either whether it's nuclear tests or missile tests, and then they try to base it on the fact that they are interpreting South Korean actions as adversarial. So this could lead to further miscalculation on both sides.
Absolutely, ma'am. With that, I'd like to thank you for taking out time and explaining what's happening to our viewers. On that note, we're tracking further updates. We're now learning that South Korea's Coast Guard has launched an urgent search after a Chinese fishing vessel capsized off the country's west coast, leaving 9 crew members missing. The vessel, carrying 11 people, was reportedly had reportedly capsized about 150 kilometers from Gunsan city. Now, authorities have deployed 4 Coast Guard vessels and 3 aircrafts, including a rescue helicopter, to conduct search and rescue operations. 2 crew members have been rescued by a nearby ship, while the remaining 9 are still unaccounted for. Officials continue to coordinate efforts to locate the missing crew, emphasizing upon the severity of the incident and the urgency of maritime safety in the region. More news coming in. Typhoon Phungwang has ravaged the northern Philippines overnight by killing at least 2 people and cutting off some towns as residents have emerged now in the morning after a sleepless night to start assessing the damage. Listen in to what a resident had to say.
Nung bandang 6, doon na po namin naramdaman yung hangin tsaka konting ulan po. Then bandang 9 na po, 9 to 10 hanggang magbanda na yung araw po. Ito po, ganda na po nangyari. Sobrang lakas na po. Halos lahat po ng mga puno, nagsitumbahan na po. At yun po, paglabas po namin kanina, ganda na po natnan namin. Sobrang sirang-sirang na po talaga. At ayun po, kitang-kita rin po dito sa harap. Nasira rin po talaga yung poste po ng kuryente. At di ko po alam, baka sa susunod na araw po bumalik ang kuryente dito sa amin.
More than 1 million people were evacuated before Typhoon Phongwang made a landfall as a super typhoon in the eastern town of Dinalungan in Aurora province. It pounded parts of the country's main island of Luzon with fierce winds, heavy rains and storm swells. Well, viewers, on that note, it's a wrap on the China Report. We will continue to track all of these updates very, very closely. In the meantime, we're dipping into a quick short break.